Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of CPAC Live. What a great show we have for you today. We're going to have with us our great Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and then after what will hopefully be a really interesting conversation with the Secretary, a follow-up with Katie Pavlich, who has been covering the Secretary's really historic work very closely, and we're going to have a conversation about what's going on in the world and how President Trump and his policies are changing the way we think about globalism and our approach to our allies overseas. But first, we want to immediately bring in to the conversation the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. How are you, Mr. Secretary?
Matt, I'm great. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for having me on today. I'm looking forward to our conversation a great deal.
We're doing great, but the world is still obviously a troubled place. We're so happy that you're there at the State Department, implementing the president's approach to how we should rethink some of these big questions around the globe. But first, I have to ask you, a lot of people don't realize how grueling the job of Secretary of State is. You got to get on that plane and go everywhere all over the world at a moment's notice all the time. You have to keep your diplomatic cheer even when you really don't want to. And you've been doing it for a long time. What motivates you every morning to get up and do this job?
Oh, Matt, that's a great question. And I think, you've had the chance to serve in a presidential administration. Every day I get up with the intention, quite clearly, of executing on what the American people have asked us to do. They elected President Trump, who has a fundamentally different understanding of making sure that American people are safe, that we're taking care of America's commercial and economic prosperity. President Trump took a very different view. Our policies have changed dramatically from the previous 8 years, and I get the chance every day to go around the world and not only talk about that, but provide assistance, helping other countries understand how, if they partner with America and do it in the right way, their prosperity, their lives of their people will be better, and that'll redound to the benefit of us right back here at home in the United States.
Now, we've had a lot of different kinds of people obviously have this important job, obviously Thomas Jefferson on down. What is unique about you is you come to the job as Secretary of State. Yes, you were elected to Congress and you had a conservative voting record in Congress. You were at the CIA, but you have a lot of business experience, which is unusual in this post. How has that helped you?
Yeah, it's true, Matt. I turn to that all the time. Your folks know too. The president has a lot of business experience. Yes. We've got our entire national security team, right? Secretary Mnuchin, Attorney General Barr came from the business world too. Spent a lot of time there. It's important because in the end, our foreign policy is as powerful as the American capacity for innovation, creativity, all the things that have really been at the center of America's exceptionalism. We have a set of values and principles founded in our Constitution. But our capacity for creating prosperity around the world gives me an enormous leg up. I think about what President Trump has unleashed in the energy space. And now when I travel the Middle East or to Europe, they know that America is self-sufficient with regard to its energy needs, and we have the capacity to deliver them affordable energy so their people can have electricity and the things that every person around the world is crying out for. That opportunity that President Trump has created here domestically for our innovation and creativity and productivity gives me enormous leverage as I try to make sure that we protect Americans all around the world.
So it's like a mirror image when I think of the communist government of China. In America, what you're saying is our foreign policy is one of the foundations of it is making sure that we have a vibrant free market economy. China is really involved in business too. The difference is the communist government seems to own all these state-owned enterprises and these big corporate entities in their country. Give us your perspective about how their system is so much different and so problematic.
So President Trump, when he campaigned, talked about the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. I remember it so well back in 2015 and 2016. And we set about changing what's really now coming on 4 decades of history, where the idea was that if we engaged, Americans would be better off. And while there have certainly been commercial benefits that have flowed from that, the risk to the American people is significant. And so President Trump has essentially told the Chinese Communist Party, look, we welcome the Chinese people being successful. We want them to have good lives too, but not at the expense of America, not at the expense of American farmers, American businesses, not at the expense of having our intellectual property created by, Matt, you know, these people who go to work every day and then come up with a good idea, a business practice, a policy, some kind of intellectual property, and then have it stolen by the Chinese government.
Right.
President Trump has simply said we're not going to tolerate that anymore. And the Chinese Communist Party denying basic freedoms to their own people has a upstream impact on freedom all around the world. And you see it with the software that China has put here in the United States. All these things impact us here at home, and President Trump has said enough. And so we have shifted. We have shifted from a policy of appeasement and engagement to one that says, look, we want to find places to work with you, but we're going to distrust but verify. We're going to make sure we protect the American people from the challenges that the Chinese Communist Party is presented across the broad range of activities that they're engaged in. They have a different ideology, Matt. You know this, right? Communists have a different view of how the world ought to work, and I want, and I know you want, and President Trump wants to make sure that this next century is not a century that is governed by authoritarian regimes emanating from China.
I love how you say, we tried appeasement for 40 years. We thought we'll be nice, we'll invite them in, they'll change, come our way. After you give that a whole lifetime to work and it doesn't work, you get tougher. And you guys very specifically have gotten tougher. You've put sanctions out there. You've taken stronger steps. Are there any specifics you want to kind of highlight to our CPAC community of the things you've done and the things you're thinking about doing?
Matt, it's important to understand that the activity that we've taken with respect to them is founded in our constitutional principles, right? This is where it all begins for President Trump and our foreign policy, the central underpinnings of America and our prosperity and security. And so whether that is the trade agreement that the president entered into, demanding that China behave in a way that's fair and reciprocal, whether it's the work we did, you saw the other day that we demanded that the Chinese close down a facility in Houston where they were spying on us here from the United States. We'd known about it for too long, and we simply didn't want to push back, and President Trump said, fine, this is the time. These are the kinds of activities. I'll give another example. In our schools, you've seen the Department of Justice and the FBI begin to take action that says it's fine if there's a Chinese student that wants to come study here, but they can't be connected to the Chinese state and the People's Liberation Army. And when they are, we're going to find out if they lied, and if they committed a crime, we'll prosecute them. And if not, we're going to just tell them they need to get back home. This is the way we protect American educational institutions, all the things that people all across America know are right. President Trump is actually delivering on, and our State Department is working to implement on behalf of the American people.
As an aside, if I won't make you comment on this, but if one of our universities doesn't think a ROTC program is appropriate on a campus, it's hard to see how someone attached to the PLA is appropriate. But that's my comment, not yours. But I applaud that policy. Then you have this question about the fundamental freedoms, and I think we all woke up with the horrific news about Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, who we consider to be a great freedom fighter. I think you know that he invited CPAC into his home in Hong Kong, and we had a delightful meal that ended early in the hours with a firebombing of his house because we had been there. Obviously, you're trying to make sure that there's a better result in Hong Kong, but you've taken some steps. What should the American people think when they look at this news this morning?
It's really sad. Jimmy Lai was nothing more than a patriot who wanted good things for the people of Hong Kong. He wanted basic freedoms. These were the freedoms, Matt. You had a chance to meet him there. I had a chance to meet him here in the United States. These are just the basic freedoms that every human being, because they're made in the image of God, is entitled to. And that's all they were asking for. And it's all, frankly, that they wanted. The Chinese Communist Party had promised them that they would have that when they entered into the agreement with Britain. And now the Chinese Communist Party has decided, no, Hong Kong's going to just simply be another communist city. So what we have tried to do is create a set of incentives for the Chinese Communist Party to rethink how they're approaching this. I'm not optimistic, given what we saw this morning and what we've seen over the past week, that they're going to change what they're doing. But what we can be sure, and President Trump has said, is that to the extent the Chinese Communist Party treats Hong Kong as just another communist-run city, the United States will do the same. We're not going to allow Beijing to benefit from the harm they're imposing on the people of Hong Kong. Our United Kingdom counterparts have done great work. They're going to allow people from Hong Kong who want to come to Britain to come there, people who've denied these just fundamental basic freedoms. I hope that the Chinese Communist Party will reconsider and allow the promises they made to the Hong Kong people to come through. But you saw, goodness, it was last week now, I think, when they declared that they were going to delay their election, they would have been crushed. Freedom would have won in the election, Matt, and the Chinese Communist Party couldn't permit that to happen. I fear that we may have had our last democratic election in Hong Kong. I hope that I'm wrong about that.
Well, you're being a realist, which we very much appreciate. And one of the things that they've also announced is they've actually barred several senators from travel to China and taken other steps. I read through the list this morning. It was interesting. All Republican senators and a Republican member of the House of Representatives. Is there truly no bipartisan consensus that when China takes these horrific acts against human rights, like arresting Jimmy Lai, is there not a bipartisan consensus to push back, or should I be more hopeful?
I'm actually more hopeful on this, Matt. When the legislation was passed, the Hong Kong Democracy Act, it was passed near unanimously, both parties. When the issue in the West about how religious minorities are being treated in the western part of China, this is truly tragic. Over 1 million people living in conditions that remind us of what happened back in the 1930s, right? Forced sterilizations, imprisonment, internment, a really disastrous scenario that when legislation came up in Congress to sanction individuals involved in that, it was bipartisan. I think nearly every member of Congress from both parties voted for it. I think with respect to the challenges that the Communist Party is presenting in China, I actually think there's good overlap, but it's the case. This policy was driven by President Trump. He was the one who was prepared to rip the Band-Aid off, acknowledge that the policies of the past decades had not been successful, and demand that the Chinese Communist Party behave in a way that is consistent with simple things like the rule of law and transparency and reciprocity. Those fundamental principles are inescapable demands that we intend to impose upon the Chinese Communist Party. We hope they'll do it, and if not, we're going to demand that they do.
We talked a lot about in this country facing the threat of radical Islamic terror post 9/11 and changing a lot of policies in the government. The Trump administration continues to keep its eye on these terrorists and terrorist organizations and terrorist regimes. Give us a status of what a threat the regime in Iran is to peace and stability around the world.
So, Matt, Iran sadly remains the world's largest state sponsor of terror. President Trump came in and recognized that underwriting that regime was a bad policy. That's what the JCPOA had done. It essentially allowed businesses to operate there, allowing the regime to continue its corrupt theocracy. President Trump said, no, we're not going to do that. We walked away from the JCPOA, and then we began to impose real costs on the regime, and it's had an impact. It's reduced the capacity for them to conduct terror around the world. I could spend a lot of time talking about the Shia militias in Iraq and what's taking place in Syria and Hezbollah. They are diminished. It's harder for them to pay their soldiers, pay their people around the world. There's still work to do, and we aim to do it. One of the true tragedies of the JCPOA was that it was very limited in time. A major provision expires now on October 18th, so just a couple months off, where Iran, under a deal that President Obama and Vice President Biden signed off on, can buy and sell weapons all around the world on October 18th of this year. We're going to try and stop that. We're trying to extend that arms embargo. I'm hopeful that we'll be successful. But this is the kind of terror risk that the previous administration simply refused to take on, and President Trump has been clear. We killed Qasem Soleimani. We took down Hamza bin Laden. We took down al-Baghdadi. This administration has been most serious about protecting the American people from terrorism. We'll continue that effort.
The biggest threat to peace and security on the globe is not global climate change. Under President Trump, it seems like you are clear-eyed, wide-eyed about what our threats are. A aggressive regime in China, radical Islamic terror regimes around the globe. And we appreciate very much you kind of resetting those ideas. Mr. Secretary, you're also a well-trained lawyer. You probably don't want to say that too loudly, but it's the truth. And when you look at the American experience with democracy, this idea of federalism, of individual rights, separation of powers, and you go around the globe and you see all these authoritarian regimes and all of these strong men and all of these governments that too easily trample on the rights of the individual. And you come back and you look at this conversation in America about, is America a good place? Is America a rotten place? Is America a place of hate? Or is America a place where the individual really can live their beautiful American life? Give us more of a philosophical overview. Is this a moment when America really needs to stand up and be proud of its history? Or is it a different time?
Matt, when I came to the State Department, I recognized the centrality of the question that you just asked. So I undertook a couple things. One was to put a woman named Marion Glendon in charge of a commission to look at human rights issues around the world and how America should think about these unalienable rights. They came back with a report a few weeks ago now, and it reminded me of the importance of the fact that this is the most exceptional nation in the history of civilization. And whatever challenges we may have on any given day, there's no nation that has the capacity to protect the freedoms that matter to every human being. And so the commission wrote about this. They talked about our Declaration of Independence and our founding. They talked about our Constitution, how it was drafted, right? The Soviet Union had a Bill of Rights too. It was worthless because it didn't have a structure around it. It didn't have a system. It didn't have, as you described, right, a bicameral legislature, federalism, all the elements that drive us ever closer to that more perfect union. As the Secretary of State, it is imperative that these things continue here in America. We were not a nation that was founded on the central idea of slavery. We're not a nation that says when the left takes to the streets that they can destroy the First Amendment and say, no, we're not going to let certain people have their voices be said. This is a challenging time which demands us to view even more closely to the things our founders knew. This Judeo-Christian foundation for our nation is so central to the work that I do around the world and my capacity to be effective to convince others of the importance of respecting the rights of their people, that I'm very, very much hopeful that the American people will see this. They will come to understand that they live in this special place. I promise you, all around the world, when people are deciding where they want to go if they leave their own country, they want to come to the United States for the very reasons that you and I both know, Matt.
Yeah, and the final question as we let you get back to settling all these really important issues. What we found with our kind of humble and meek aspect of global travel, where we had these CPACs in 5 different important parts of the globe last year, unfortunately with the virus, we're not doing that travel, but we will again next year. What the big takeaway I got is when people overseas who are freedom loving see America in a conflict about what America stands for, will America still stand for the freedoms it's always stood for? It really jars them, it worries them, because even in places that we don't always automatically think love America, they actually love a strong America more than we'll ever know. Do you have the same type of reaction at a much higher level than we have?
Matt, I do. You should know that the people of every nation watch closely what we do here in the United States. And we've had conflict before. We've often had vigorous debates here in the United States. It is very important that we demonstrate to the world, for all the right reasons, that America remains strong, that America remains committed. We'll get right our commitments around the world. We're not going to think about them the way we did for the past 20 years, but America as a leader, as an exemplar on the world stage will remain, and that is vital for people all across the world. So it's exactly the same thing you're hearing when people, as you travel around the world. I see it every day.
And I want you to know we appreciate you making time for us. Our CPAC community is very proud of what you're accomplishing. They've been proud of you as you have accomplished great things throughout your public career. And I want you to know, having just come back from Wichita, Kansas, having just had prime rib at the Candle, that when you're done with this work, there's a good meal waiting for you there, okay?
I'll meet you at the Candle. That sounds great, Matt.
That's the deal, Mr. Secretary. Keep up the great work, and we're going to
Thank you.
We're going to show a great clip about Jimmy Lai's response to what's going on with the clampdown in Hong Kong. Obviously, before he was arrested. On the other side of this clip, we'll be joined by Katie Pavlich from Town Hall. We'll be right back after this video.
People say that, if you guys behave, we wouldn't have to come to this. Well, if this is true, today, the world will not have democracy. The world will not have freedom. We have freedom today and democracy because our ancestors has been fighting for it. Many people died for it. Much blood was shed for it. It can't stop just here.
The prospect of spending the rest of your life in jail, perhaps in a Chinese prison, wouldn't exactly thrill you.
Well, I'm not going to think about this. I'm not going to think about things that scares me. I'm staying here. I'm staying here till the end. If we go down together. We burn together. That's my promise to my people.
Well, that's a very sobering interview with 60 Minutes of Australia with Jimmy Lai, who many of us woke up this morning to the tragic news that he's been arrested and under this new law in Hong Kong, forced on the people of Hong Kong by the power of the communist government in Beijing. Somebody, a peaceful protester, a democracy advocate in Hong Kong can be ripped out of their home and brought to Beijing. So this is, really perilous times for Hong Kongers. And we're joined by Katie Pavlich, editor of Town Hall. Katie, you were able to listen into this conversation that I had with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He's someone you know well. You've traveled with him. You're covering what he's doing around the globe. What's your reaction to this latest news in Hong Kong?
Yeah, the arrest of Jimmy Lai was just a gut-wrenching news to so many people who've been covering that story, as you guys talked about in your interview. And it's not just simply about peaceful protesters, as you know, Matt. It's about the Chinese Communist Party breaking a treaty that they had to allow for Hong Kong to remain autonomous. And, a lot of the time, I think here in America, we're very focused on the news of the day and what's happening right now. But the issue of Hong Kong and the Chinese Communist Party continuing to grasp for power all over the world is a long-term problem for the United States of America. People may ask the question, well, why does Hong Kong matter to me? First of all, they're very pro-American. As we remember, they were waving American flags as they were protesting peacefully against the Chinese Communist Party as they were parking tanks outside of Hong Kong, threatening to come into the city to destroy and kill protesters. And now we're seeing that they're arresting them. And I can't even imagine what they may be doing to the peaceful people who have the right under this treaty to protest and be autonomous as they, as you said, rip them out of their homes and take them to Beijing for questioning over simply just living in a place that is supposed to be free from the strong arm of the Communist Party. But in terms of how we deal with this moving forward, Hong Kong is a huge financial center. This is something that President Trump has talked about. If the Chinese Communist Party is going to run Hong Kong, well, there are going to be major questions about whether we can continue to do financial transactions there. And the rest of the world is also asking that question.
Yeah, and when we go back to like 2015, 2016, as President Trump was thinking about running for president, clearly he'd been thinking about it for a long time. And we had this big Republican primary, which I always view as a good thing. You have a big conversation about what a party believes. But it was very, very troubling to a lot of Republicans, this idea that, well, let's face it, number one, that would we actually move our embassy, right? In Israel, because we have been told, well, that's irresponsible. It's the right thing to do morally, but it's irresponsible practically. And we had this whole idea of repositioning the government about climate change being the number one threat to human freedom, and President Trump saying, no, there's a lot of other things that are a bigger threat. But this question of China, breaking down this house of cards, this economic house of cards, in order to reset the relationship, which could result in some economic harm for people in America, was very, very controversial. Looking back on this now, what's your reaction to what Secretary Pompeo and the president have done?
Yeah, I mean, this was a big question, a big gamble that everybody, a lot of people were asking, and whether the president's moves on China would be beneficial to America. And I think that the president has been completely vindicated by the way that the Chinese Communist Party has handled the results of the pandemic that they unleashed on the world, and what they did to hoard PPE and prevent American companies from exporting medical supplies to people in America and around the world who really needed them. I think the president has been spot on about China. He continues to talk about how he's been dealing with this issue for decades. He's been all over them. And the truth is that even after President Trump leaves office, hopefully in 2024, because Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi is saying this week that China actually wants Joe Biden to be president. And on that issue, I think it's very troubling that the Chinese Communist Party would want someone like Joe Biden, because that means they'll be able to get away with a lot of their power grabs moving forward. But in terms of the policies that the president has put in place on trade and also convincing our allies, the last big trip that I went on with Secretary Pompeo was at the Munich Security Conference, where he was he was trying to convince through a fact-based argument that Huawei was bad for our European allies. And you fast forward now, after the pandemic, this was right when the pandemic was really starting and when we were knew about it. You have our British allies saying no more Huawei for us. And that was not something that was coming easily for us. It was a real fight to try and remind people that what Huawei would mean for them, and in terms of giving the Chinese power. And then we went through Africa on that trip, and we saw the aftermath of all these African countries signing on with the Chinese to build infrastructure. And they call it a curse now that they got in bed with the Chinese economically, because they are now in so much debt to a Chinese Communist Party that does not have their interest in mind. It's not a partnership. They're indebting these countries to the Chinese Communist Party. And so it's been interesting to see this shift from the allies, as Secretary Pompeo has been successful in explaining what the Chinese Communist Party is up to, and that we are a better ally for them long term.
By the way, all that infrastructure where the Communist government of China comes in, whether it's in the Caribbean or in Africa or wherever, but the one constant in all the infrastructure is it starts to crumble because it's made crappy, because these are short-term promises for long-term domination.
And pain, long-term pain for the people there. And you're right, they'll build a bridge that will collapse, and then they'll walk away and say, oh, we had nothing to do with that. It's not our responsibility. I was on another Pompeo trip, and we were in Finland for the Arctic Circle conference, and China was there for some reason, arguing that they were a near Arctic country. And then when one of the foreign ministers was asked about whether they are responsible when they build these buildings and infrastructure in these countries and they collapse and actually kill people, whether they're responsible, and he just didn't even answer the question. So it's all about getting people hooked on that money with a false promise of somehow being a partner, when really it's about global dominance.
Well, let's make a partnership here between CPAC and you, Katie. Our goal is to get on that list of what'd you say?
That's long established.
Let's make a deal that we want to be on the next list of people barred from going to China, okay? Because that's quite an honor roll, I would consider, at least with those Republican senators and Chris Smith from the House and these other human rights activists. But I also want to just ask you this question about, we're going in, obviously the Democrats are doing everything they can to not get the campaign started, but the Constitution says we have to have a campaign, and there's going to be an election in November, despite what some people in the media think Donald Trump is trying to do. When you look at the global scene, who are the people across the globe that most don't want to see Donald Trump get a second term?
I think Vladimir Putin. I mean, if you look at the number of sanctions that this administration has put on Russia, the most recent being that they essentially cut off gas sales from a number of companies to Russia and Europe. That was a big deal that didn't get a lot of attention. The Chinese Communist Party, which is waging a war not only on the United States, but on the rest of the world, as we've seen with the pandemic alone. That's just one thing that has opened up Pandora's box to everything and put a microscope on everything that the Chinese are doing. I think that Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela would prefer that President Trump lose. So, they always say you can judge people by their enemies. I think that the president is judged by his enemies, and his enemies are enemies of the country and have very bad intentions, not just for the United States of America, but for the Western world in general. And so I think those are the people who would prefer to see President Trump lose.
And you have this domestic conversation, too, including people that might have at one time called themselves conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
You have Republicans, maybe in name only, maybe they're rhinos, but you have some opposition to the president there. When you see our country turning towards socialism, our universities indoctrinating our students and our children, major corporations funding, revolutionary groups, to quote the Attorney General Bill Barr on Mark Levin's show. When you see this whole question about America kind of like embracing, or at least segments of America embracing this radicalism, why would anybody who's kind of a Chamber of Commerce establishment, middle of the road Republican, try to help this leftist Democratic Party, which there's no intersection with our fundamental beliefs on what makes our country good and great and our economy strong and our people better?
And not just that, like basic concept of the way that our free market capitalist system works. And these people believe in Marxism and communism and socialism. These two things can't go together. And the idea that the Chamber of Commerce would think that they have anything in common with someone like a Rashida Tlaib or an AOC, the AOC doesn't believe that she has anything in common with a Chamber of Commerce type Republican. I mean, they have no intention of coming halfway on any of those things. And I think that people try to downplay the idea that, this socialism is just a fringe movement and it's the squad and it's very small. It may be small now, but if you look at the elections that were successful last week with a woman who is far left in Missouri taking out an establishment Democrat,
right,
and expanding that far left coalition, I think the next 10 years in America are going to be an eye-opening experience for a lot of people who have said this is a movement that can be underestimated. The far left is here to stay. It's going to be a fight not just for, between Republicans and Democrats, but for larger issues and principles for the country and how we operate in our economy. They want to change everything and tear it down. And you look at the groups that they support, Black Lives Matter, for example, saying, if we don't get what we want, we're going to burn the system down. And as you know, literally, we've been seeing cities across the country burning because they're not getting what they want. And so I think people have to take it seriously and always remember that the appeasers are the ones who get eaten first. There's no room for negotiation with people who want to burn down the system if they don't get what they want.
You mean you don't think Anthony Scaramucci will be rewarded with a cabinet position?
I don't think so. Given how long he lasted last time in government, I'm not sure if he's a good one for the job.
Do you think John Bolton would be his Secretary of State? I don't think so either. I don't think this is.
I'm not sure. No, I don't think on that one. Maybe put some money down.
Katie Pavlich, thanks for all the great work you do, whether it's on our TV sets or in the columns that you write, or this important coverage that you do around the globe with people like Mike Pompeo. We consider you a great ally and a clarion of truth in a very troubled time. And thanks for calling out the people by name who are trying to destroy this country. I think that's a very important thing to do. I will remind you that when we were on the streets of Hong Kong with Jimmy Lai and with Andy Chan and with these others, so many of the students would come up to us and say to us, please go back to America and tell your president he's the first president who has our backs. Yeah. So I think it's not just who your enemies are, but it's also who your friends are.
Yeah, and thank you, Matt, and everything CPAC has been doing to back up the Hong Kongers. And let's just pray for Jimmy Lai, because I think he's going to need the prayers.
And who's that in the background? You got to remind us who your dog is.
Sorry, Gadsden's here. So sorry.
He's a beauty, by the way. I want to see him again.
Okay.
Katie Pavlich, thanks for joining us on CPAC Live, and thanks to all of you for listening. And what a great show! And we look forward to coming at you on Wednesday with another great show. Have a great day.